Back on the Newsfeed PM, there are reports that Parliament is set to rush through a bill allowing President Cyril Ramaphosa to set limits for party funds that the party can be able to receive in donation. The proposed bill gives Parliament the power to raise the limits on the donations and reporting from time to time. It's supposed to make consequential amendments to the legislation following the enactment of the Electoral Amendment Act. Here to help us dissect how this may affect political parties, I'm now joined by the independent elections analyst Michael Atkins. Michael, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. We know the ANC has been having trouble raising money because of this limit that is being put on political funding and I suppose the reporting processes. Is this amendment bill going to be rushed through on that account?
Well, it's being rushed through because it needs to be passed before the election period begins. And it's quite interesting. You referred to the limits on the Political Party Funding Act, but the existence of this bill is because of the amendments in the Electoral Amendment Act that was passed earlier this year, including independent candidates into our provincial and national elections. So the changes to the limits is an extra feature that is not directly related to the Electoral Amendment Act that was passed. And it's likely to be fairly controversial, the changes that you mentioned.
What is it that is concerning about the fact that this bill is not yet tabled? Of course, others are saying the elections are in May. The president has, of course, not announced on that.
Well, the election period can be effectively from any time from the 22nd of May, probably to the 14th of August. But the best understanding we have is that this Electoral Matters Amendment Bill must be in force before the President actually legally proclaims the election date. Because when the President gazettes that election date, the election timetable commences. So the official election period begins. Now, it would seem extremely unlikely that we could begin that election timetable without a number of the changes that this Electoral Matters Amendment Bill brings into force, particularly the party funding, or it'll be political funding from now, and also the changes to the Electronic Communications Act, because the broadcast rules apply during an election period. And it seems unusual that the idea that independent candidates might go into an election period without the regulation of political broadcasts being completed. So this act is being rushed through Parliament, as you mentioned. There are a number of dates for public submissions, committee meetings through February next year. But it seems unlikely that this act can be in force before the beginning of April. So if the understanding is correct, I don't see how we could be proclaiming an election date, the actual proclamation, before the beginning of April. And that election timetable is going to be 70 or more days to run.
Yeah.
So the timing issue is actually quite sensitive.
Is this amendment, from what we are getting as an explanation, as simple as just the president bringing in independent candidates into the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill or the Political Party Funding Act legislation, so that it's just in line to the Electoral Amendment Act? Or is there more that they are changing with this amendment?
Yes, that's a good question. Mostly this Electoral Matters Amendment Bill are what were termed the consequential amendments to the Electoral Amendment Act that was passed. So just including the definitions of independent candidates, changing the Electoral Commission Act so that they liaise with independent candidates and with parties. But obviously the funding rules for independent candidates must be included. Broadcast rules must apply to independent candidates. And then there are other technical areas. It's the administration of Parliament and provincial legislatures. Those are less controversial. But the ability to change the limits is not required by having independent candidates. That was an independent change, as it were, that was brought about alongside accommodating independent candidates. And what is required, you first of all have the limit for donations, and secondly, the limit for disclosure of donations. In each case, Parliament would need to pass a resolution according to this bill, and then the President makes the determination of how much those limits are changed by. Now, in terms of the limit on donations, there are a few factors listed like inflation and the actual costs of running political parties. But in terms of the disclosure limit, the bill only says if Parliament passes a resolution that this disclosure limit must be increased, the President can increase it to anything he likes. There is no condition, no rules. Even the donations limit is very wide and open to interpretation. And as it stands, this bill effectively destroys the effect of the Political Party Funding Act of 2018. Parliament and the President could simply raise the limits above whatever is practically realistic. And the idea of limits is then destroyed.
So according to this bill, it said that it seeks to also create or introduce an offense in the line of anybody who donates to a party or to an independent candidate should therefore not expect a tender or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, but really that's certainly what they're trying to achieve here. Is that necessary?
Well, there are a couple of offences, as you mentioned, that you can't make donations to a party with the idea of getting something in return. And there's another offence related to you can't donate to an individual to try and get round another section of the Funding Act. These are useful and necessary sort of clarifications. But in effect, these things are already prohibited in terms of the Prevention of Corrupt Activities Act, the PRECA Act. So whether they are needed at this time and what difference they make at this time is not clear, because already legislation covers those scenarios that are described in the Act. It's just making it slightly clearer. So in my view, they are not strictly necessary at this time. And given the short time available to pass this Act, it's a question as to whether additional matters should have been introduced.
Elections analyst Michael Atkins, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on the Newsfeed PM.